Hey, what's up guys, Sir Emanon here, bringing to you today the countdown for my picks of the top 50 Yu-Gi-Oh cards of the past decade from 2010 to 2019. Now I want to apologize first off that this is a little bit late. I had some technical difficulties while recording yesterday and my audio got entirely messed up after I recorded for like an hour or so. So that combined with some New Year's Eve plans didn't really allow me to get this video out on time, so I want to apologize for that. But we're still here today and I spent a long time making the list as well as recording this video, so I do want to definitely, present this to you guys because I'm very excited to, and I hope you all enjoy. This is of course going to be covering Absolute Power Force, 2 Chaos Impact Special Edition, so just keep that in mind. And without further ado, let's just go ahead and dive on in. So before we get into the actual list here, I just want to lay out some groundwork for the video. So there were a couple of different criteria that I used to construct the list. The first thing that I considered was the card's general impact on the whole game. Like if there is a card that really needs to be considered when players deck build regardless of the format, then that is something that I felt was pretty important as it affects the whole game, so I considered that pretty highly. The next things were some things that I kind of considered, pretty equally important. They could supersede, the impact on the entire game if those three factors were strong enough, but I thought about, the card's strength in the time period in which they came out in, as well as their current viability, or, if it was a banned card, how strong would the card be if it were to be unbanned, and finally the popularity as far as how often the card was used in both historical and current contexts. The next thing I thought about was the effect that the card might have in the future, either in card design or metagames. For me, this is a little bit less important since we're talking about like a historical outlook, but it is nice to look at if a card will still be, good if it were to continue on into the 2020s. Next up, I realize that this is maybe a little bit obvious, but I want to just clarify that the cards that are released are specifically worldwide TCG releases from 2010 to 2019, meaning that things like jump promos and other regional exclusive cards will not be considered in terms of those dates being released, but rather it'll just be when the entire TCG world was able to receive those cards. So just keep that in mind. And also, I realize that I do have some bias as far as a player is concerned because I only started playing the game really in like early 2017, so from a historical perspective, I don't really have experience to go off of, which is why there might be some recency bias as a result. But thankfully, I do have my Discord server to back me up here, so I want to give a huge shout out to you guys for helping me out here, as well as the community tab that, kind of pitched in some ideas of their own. So yeah, if you guys do want to join my Discord, I do, reach out to some of you guys for ideas on videos, and we just hang out and have a pretty chill time. Definitely feel free to join my Discord server. The link is in the description below. And follow me on Twitch and Twitter and that good stuff. But yeah, everything's in the description, and without further ado, let's begin with the list. Alright, so kicking things off at number 50, we actually have a card that, although we don't have a lot of tournament historical experience to kind of judge this card empirically, we do know for sure that it is relevant and will continue to be relevant for as long as it exists in the metagame. And that card is actually Nibiru the Primal Being. So despite this card being released only in the past like 5 or 6 months or so, this card really has made its impact on the game just because of its existence alone. Because of how powerful it is and just its ability to stop pretty much any combo deck in its tracks, people really have to build their decks with this card in mind, whether it's actively, making deck building choices that play around it, or taking alternate lines in their actual combos to try and not lose to this card. And even when it's not being played because it's being respected, it's because this card is actually being accounted for so highly, despite it not actually being, present in a lot of top cut deck lists. So kind of just because of that internal push and pull, where people are going to either play it because people aren't respecting it, or not play it because people are respecting it too much, this card is always just going to be a central focal point of how people deck build, and that's definitely why I felt it deserved a spot on this list. At number 49, we have another card that kind of just shapes the way that people decide to build certain decks, as well as how people side for games 2 and 3 especially, and that card is actually going to be evenly matched. So despite this card not being that great in a lot of contexts, it can definitely be a blowout for people who aren't respecting it. And just simply this card's existence causes people who play, certain decks like back row heavy decks or combo decks that don't have an answer to it, to really play cautiously and not invest all their resources onto the board, especially in games 2 and 3. It impacts side deck choices. Cards like Solemn Judgment, Wiretap, and even Dark Bribe were all played because of this card alone. And it really is the ultimate equalizer for people who simply just aren't prepared for it. So yeah, definitely because of how this card really shaped the way that people, decided to, play going second post sideboard, I really do think that it is a worthy candidate to be on this list. Number 48 is a very interesting entry because while it hasn't seen a lot of historical play in terms of tournament success simply because of its release date, it definitely is a card that kind of just transformed the way that people approach certain hand traps. And this card is Infinite Impermanence. So this card just really answered a lot of the weaknesses to hand traps as far as, counterplay is concerned, because there's very few stops that people have to this card that aren't extremely archetype specific or specific to side decks. And this card has so much added utility that it really just kind of makes the gold star standard of hand traps in terms of being so widely applicable across many different matchups, but also just having so many other activation conditions and benefits to certain, other uses that it really just doesn't have any other parallel. And despite it not being played, a lot again because of it not being around for as long as some of the other cards on this list, it definitely is a card that has a lot of future promise and will continue to be good for as long as it's relevant. At number 47, we have a card that really was the bane of many players' existences, and one of the first of a couple Pendulum monsters on this list actually, and that card is Magispector Unicorn Kirin. So this card is extremely accessible by cards like Bumbuku and newer cards that would be, aiding it if this card was still legal, such as Electromite. And this card is extremely strong as an end board piece. It's extremely hard for your opponent to deal with, and very oppressive as it keeps coming back turn after turn after turn. There are outs to this card, things like Photon Thrasher back when ABC was prominent, or more modern answers, maybe like stuff like Pankratops, if this card were to be unbanned. But overall, this card is extremely oppressive as a threat. Just having so much protection on top of its extremely disruptive capability makes it extremely difficult and overwhelming for opponents across the board. At number 46, we have a card that was pretty infamous for being able to accrue an absurd amount of advantage, and that card is going to be Spellbook of Judgment. Often considered the predecessor for something like multi-roll nowadays, this card definitely allowed you to just add so many different spellbook cards, including quick plays that you can just add in the end, activate on the end phase, as well as summoning out stuff like Jogging the Spiritualist to lock your opponent out. It was very strong as a part of a very searchable and recyclable archetype, and really was one of the defining characteristics of the format that it was a part of, alongside, another entry that is going to be on this list, as I'm sure you guys already know. But yeah, this card was definitely a force to be reckoned with, and certainly not a card to be slept on. Coming in at number 45, we have a card that has a very potent ability to dish out so much damage on its own and really just end games by itself. And this card is Borosword Dragon. So with the ability to include this very generic Link monster in pretty much every strategy, pretty much any deck can OTK out of nowhere, even the control ones like Sky Striker or the more notoriously aggressive ones like Combo Thunder. This card really just does it all, and just the fact that it is so easy to access and does something that pretty much no other card does, unless if you're playing an archetype specific OTK card, it really just kind of transformed the way that people approached, winning the game via battle damage, and that's something that will continue to be relevant even in Master Rule 2020. So at number 44, we have a card that maybe people are surprised that I put this low on the list, but I'll kind of explain as I get further along in the video, as well as this card itself. But it was still a part of a very potent archetype and one of the strongest ones in the game, and that is going to be Zodiac Trident. So Trident is a very powerful component of the Zodiac archetype simply because it was kind of just the end piece of Zodiac's board as far as providing in-archetype disruption. Of course, I do believe the advantage of Zodiac and why it was so relevant was because of its ability to just be super consistent, recycle its resources, and just achieve the same win condition every turn, every game. But I do believe that Trident is still, an important piece of what made the deck strong. Granted, I don't believe it's as powerful as some of the other Zodiac cards that I will have on this list later on, but I believe that this card, had it not existed, would have made Zodiac, noticeably worse than it was. So still deserving of the spot on this list, and I do believe that, Zoo was obviously one of the best decks of this game's history, especially in this decade. At number 43, we have another Pendulum monster that was actually part of one of the most powerful and feared decks of the entire game, and that is going to be Perform H Plushfire. So this card was just the extender of all extenders. It was really just insane with cards like Luster Pendulum and Perform Pendulum Sorcerer, just not being once per turn, continually getting you advantage, and just having the accessibility of being a perform mage monster on top of all of that really just made this card shine. Its score is a little bit lower than maybe some of the other pendulum monsters on this list, simply because it requires a little bit more setup, but it definitely is a card that really was a defining characteristic of Pepe, and not a card to be underestimated for sure. So continuing on with the theme of pendulums for number 42, we have another monster that I feel just barely edges out Plushfire in terms of being independently powerful, and this card is going to be Performer Palace Skull Combat Joker. Joker's ability to search so many cards really can't be understated. It searches 3 different archetypes, which was partially the reason why it was featured in 2 different but very powerful pendulum strategies, the first of which was obviously Pepe alongside Plushfire, but it was also seen in 2017 Pendulum, past the Magician support in Pendulum Evolution, which featured of course Time Star Magician, which could search this card as well. And just being a normal summon in a pendulum deck, which doesn't really use normal summons too much, but being one so powerful that can just access so many different extenders or play starters as well, really just makes this card the ultimate Swiss Army knife, and it is banned for a good reason. At number 41, we have a card that really stood the test of time as far as surviving not only multiple formats in this game's history, but also in multiple eras as well, and that card is going to be Infinity Archfiend. So Infinity as a deck was very popular not only in the Synchro era, but also in the Xyz era, where it was just able to take advantage of so many different tools at its disposal. And at the heart and center of it all was Infinity Archfiend, which really just was able to get you so many different resources and allowed you to extend your combos in ways that really not many archetypes can boast of. This card will definitely also continue to see play in 2020 for the dedicated players, as the new master rule really allows you to mix and mingle not only synchros and Xyz, but also links which Infinities can use very well. So this card will continue to be a threat and be played in the years to come. And at number 40, we have a card that kind of just shaped the way that certain players approached the game for a little while, and it was home to one of the most dominant decks of 2015, and we are talking about Nekroz of Trishula. So this card really forced players to just actively think of it at all times. You know, people would sometimes actively try and keep their graveyard or their hand empty just to not lose to this card, and if you weren't prepared for it and didn't have the answer, you would just get blown out on the spot. This card really was one of the hallmark characteristics of what made Nekroz so threatening, alongside many other cards of course, but I just had to include it on this list for those reasons alone. Moving on to number 39, we have a card that I would argue even more so than Nekroz of Trishula really caused players to deck build and even more importantly play their decks a lot differently than they were used to. And that card came out in one of the most infamous formats of all time, and I'm talking about Shaddoll Fusion. So this card really kind of just punished players for playing certain decks the way that they were intended to. People would have to actively try and play around this card. I remember hearing stories of people tribute setting over their Shaddoll monsters for like a Shaddoll Beast just to not lose to this card. And it really just defined the way that the Shaddoll archetype generated advantage. And people would always have to be wary of this card when they were approaching the grind games because of its very heavy recyclability. It just did so much even though it never touched the ban list, but I do feel that it is one of the reasons why Shaddoll was able to thrive in the way that it did. At number 38, we have a card that almost single-handedly took a deck and propelled it from rogue status to pretty much tier 0, and that card is Spiral Double Helix. Now, Double Helix was instrumental in being a very key extender for this deck, allowing you to get access to cards that were otherwise previously very hard to get to, and in tandem with the other powerful Spiral cards at its disposal, this card was really able to shine. Now, it doesn't score as highly as maybe some other cards despite it being part of a tier 0 archetype, simply because I do believe that the limitation of cards around this card also made the deck a lot weaker, so that proves that this card is only as powerful as the cards it can fetch, as well as the consistency of the archetype in things like Resort and Quick Fix. But overall, this card still was really what pushed the deck to where it needed to be in terms of competitive viability, and that cannot really be understated. At number 37, we have a card that, despite being released over 7 years ago, really won't be power crept for the foreseeable future, and this card is actually going to be Abyss Dweller. So the Rank 4 toolbox has changed and evolved over the years, but Abyss Dweller was one of the cards that really just stayed and even got better over the time. Just with more graveyard-centric strategies being in the format, as well as being so easily accessible in a lot of different decks, makes this card just a force to be reckoned with, and can definitely be a turn stopper in a lot of cases. This card just, again, continues to be better and better as the format and card pools progress, so I definitely feel that this card will continue to be relevant, especially when Master Rule 2020 hits the format. Number 36 really shaped the way that pendulums would kind of adapt to the link summoning mechanic, as well as how it will continue to adapt to the Master Duel 2020 format. And this card is of course going to be Heavy Metal Foes Electromite. On paper, this card is just absolutely insane, and for a very good reason. This card pluses you, it adds extra resources to a continual resource pool that you can just access turn after turn. It allows you to just enable other cards that get pluses when being popped, and it has really good link arrows on top of it. It just is the kind of almost crutch point of pretty much every pendulum strategy out there, and Electromite, despite it being hit itself, is still one of the cards that people have to immediately look towards when building a pendulum strategy, and that's not going to change until this card gets banned, if it ever does. So this card, for all intents and purposes, is just the staple pick in any pendulum strategy, and will continue to be that way for the foreseeable future. Number 35 is actually going to be a tie, and while I don't have too many of these on the list, I feel like most of them actually do make sense and go hand in hand. And in this case, it's going to be the premier form of trap-based negation, which is going to be Solemn Strike and Solemn Warning. So yeah, you can maybe argue for these cards to be separated, but I do feel like being part of like the same series, so to speak, makes it for a very interesting legacy story. So starting off with Warning, this card really kind of just power crept a lot of the other traps in the game and allowed for trap-based interactions to be extremely powerful, especially with its ability to not really be responded to by many things other than cards like Solemn Judgment. This card really was just a one-stop shop for stopping any high investment summoning plays, and was one of the reasons why it got limited later on. Now, when Strike got released, it kind of just picked off where Warning left off, and it's still unlimited to this day. But just being able to handle kind of the faster pace of the game with like pendulum summonings and the myriad of monster effects that are running around really makes Solemn Strike a very powerful addition to the Solemn Brigade, the Solemn Arsenal. Judgment, of course, was released way before these cards, but these two were extremely powerful in the 2010 decade. At 34, we have another card from the Nekroz archetype, and one that I feel will continue to be more and more powerful if Nekroz ever sees play again, and this is going to be Nekroz of Unicorn. So I feel that while Trishul was arguably more metagame defining in its own format as far as people having to actively play around it, maybe even more so than Unicorn, Unicorn is definitely not to be underestimated even in that format, with a lot of decks like Burning Abyss, Shaddolls, and Tellarknights running around, and you have this card that really is just a very solid win condition and is easily recyclable, protectable, and accessible all at the same time when it was back at 3. Of course, this card is still limited to this day, but I do feel that if this card were ever to come off and Konami wanted to promote this deck even more, this card would be one of the reasons why people would return to this deck. And moving into Master Duel 2020, Unicorn will only continue to get stronger and stronger as more and more extra deck tools will continue to be power creeping the previous ones. Really strong card, and this is definitely one of the sort of emblems of Nekroz rather. Number 33 is definitely a personal favorite of mine, as well as many others who just enjoy playing the deck that'll never die, and that's going to be Dante Traveler the Burning Abyss. I love this card, and I am very biased, but I do believe the legacy that this card carries with it over the past 5 or so years really just shows how strong it has been over time, even with all the power creep in this game. It's survived all these different formats, it survived link summoning, and it's beaten just all the odds of people saying that this deck is going to finally die. It never has, and it's really just been the cornerstone of many different players' hearts and minds, of course. But yeah, this deck is definitely even going to be more popular in 2020 with the new Master Rule. People are experimenting with it more than ever, and it's just going to continue to be a staple part of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game for the time to come. Number 32 is an interesting one because I really feel like a lot of people would maybe exclude this from their top card lists, but I do feel like it was so prevalent and so annoying for many players to deal with. One of the most talked about cards back in its heyday, and that's going to be Fairy Tale Snow. So this card was played in so many different decks like Burning Abyss and Infernoids and Lightsworns and any other deck that can really just easily get this card into the graveyard, to be honest. Decks that would run a later card in this list I'm sure you guys can think of. Definitely took advantage of this card's easy recursion, easy interruption, and just the ability for this card to be a continual threat. It's kind of like the predecessor to Gizmek if you kind of think about it, but yeah, this card is extremely powerful with advantageous typing at that. It's a level 4 light spellcaster, extremely good in many different cases, and is banned for a very solid reason. Number 31 is a card that came out pretty early in this decade, but if it weren't banned right now, I do feel like it would definitely be played in a lot of different decks. And that card is of course going to be Dandelion. So Dandelion has seen a very rich history throughout its existence, being played in decks like Quick Draw Dandy Warrior or Plant Synchro, and of course being experimented in link summoning with, tokens being a premium resource for just generating a lot of monsters on the field. This card definitely is not, of course, once per turn, and has seen a lot of different play in a lot of different decks, both meta and rogue alike. This card would certainly be played in Master Rule 2020, and of course was banned because of how oppressive token generators, as generic as this one can be, but that just goes to show how good this card is, especially given its history. Number 30 is another tie, but I definitely feel like these cards do deserve to go together, simply because they were part of a engine, one of the most splashable ones of all time at that. And that is going to be Brilliant Fusion and Gem Knight Seraphonite. So both together and individually, these cards offer a lot of different advantages to many strategies. Brilliant allowed you to just get light monsters into the grave, which really fueled a lot of decks' advantage engines, and Seraphonite, giving you the extra body on the field as well as that normal summon, really just propels certain decks that are normal summon reliant to really thrive in a combo based sort of environment when these cards were both being played a lot. And definitely with Brilliant Fusion's limitation after so much abuse makes this engine less viable, but with people still willing to put it in their decks with the plant engine, it definitely shows that people really still like these cards. And if this card was at 3, Brilliant Fusion was at 3 in Master Rule 2020, you can definitely bet that this engine would have been hit sooner or later. So yeah, certainly deserving of this spot on the list. 29 is a card that has seen play throughout many different formats and decks, and is one of my personal favorite generic Yu-Gi-Oh cards in the game, and that's going to be Tour Guide from the Underworld. So yeah, Tour Guide has seen play in things like Dino Rabbit and other decks of that time period that just want to spam out rank 3s, things like Levier the Sea Dragon, or Leviathan Dragon, or Zen Mains, the classics, but also, of course, the modern iterations of Burning Abyss, and maybe some other fringe rogue strategies like Lair of Darkness. So with this card being searchable nowadays, as well as just its ability to spam the board with rank 3 fodder or link fodder, it really is a card that I feel will continue to be useful even moving forward. Number 28 is the most interesting entry on this list in my opinion, because I don't feel like it is stronger than really any of the cards on this list, even the ones I placed behind it. But I do feel that its ubiquity alone and just its insane versatility makes it one of the most incredibly remarkable cards in the entire game, and that's going to be Nightmare Phoenix. So this card is really a true staple, one of the really true staples that this game has had in a long time. It's played in pretty much every deck in every format ever since its release, and even with Master Rule 2020, I don't think that that'll power creep this card even a little bit. Just with it being generic back removal, that's something that every deck can appreciate, even the slower ones that don't get that many monsters on the field. This card really just does something that no other card can boast about. It's a card that doesn't have to be searched. It's a card that does one of the most simple things ever since this game's history. MST has been, one of the most powerful effects, and it just does it all in a manner that is very efficient. Of course, the discard cost can hurt for some decks, but helps others, and just the fact that it's been appeared in, I want to say 85 to 95% of top cut deck lists, totally made up statistic by the way, but still, this card has been in so many decks, and it will continue to be a presence for a long time. Number 27 is probably the most frustrating card for me to try and rank, because I had it all over the list. I had it towards the top, in the top 10, I had it like in the teens, I had it in like the 30s, and I finally kind of settled it here after I just took a bigger and better look at all the cards kind of in context with one another. But yeah, this card is one of the cards that is very near and dear to my heart, as many of you guys who are longtime viewers of this channel already know, but that is going to be Outer Entity Azathoth. This card is really interesting because it's kind of restrictive in terms of the decks it can be played in, but can still be played in a multitude of different decks, ranging from, of course, the Lunalight variants to the old Orcus decks with the, Rusty and the PK rank up, as well as things like Danger Dark World FTK. But yeah, this card is one of the cards that I feel like deserves a spot on this list because of the future problems that it will have, and I foresee this card getting banned pretty soon after this video goes up. And that is simply because Master Rule 2020 makes this card thrive even more. But yeah, the ignorance that this thing offers in terms of just having one-sided gameplay for combo players really is just pretty unfair, especially with, so many decks having so many different combos nowadays, and this card is just really a facilitator of a lot of degenerate stuff in tandem with, of course, the other cards on this list. But yeah, this card deserved a spot on this list, and I do feel like this is about the appropriate spot. Number 26 is a card that breaks the conventions of traditional extra deck summoning, and for one of the most powerful types in the game at that, and that is going to be Guard Dragon Aggro Pain. This card really cheats out so many different cards, from Vortex Dragon to Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss to Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, and even more niche things like Super Alloy Beast Raptinus for FTKs. This card really allows you to do a lot of different things that this game probably didn't intend for you to do, and in tandem with a lot of other combo pieces, some of which are going to be on this list of course. This card definitely is a powerful card that Konami felt was deemed to be ban worthy, of course. So yeah, this card is extremely good. Number 25 is another very interesting entry because these cards are very new, but they were some of the most talked about cards, for a long time. And those are, of course, the dangers, specifically the 3 good dangers in Nessie, Jackalope, and Tsuchi Noko. So yeah, these cards are of course semi-limited now, so they are a little bit more contained and less crazy, but these cards are still just extremely splashable, and I really couldn't ignore that when making this list. These cards can be played to help so many different strategies, just put the bodies onto the field with Link Summoning so prevalent in place. They allow you to just generate advantage on top of that. They never really minus you, these ones specifically, and they are just the cornerstone of a lot of different degenerate FTKs. Of course, Danger Dark World FTK comes to mind. But yeah, these cards are just probably going to be some of the best, combo related generic cards for a long time coming until they get restricted to 1 or banned, or if they ever do get hit on the ban list. But yeah, even in Master Duel 2020, these cards have the ability to tutor out very advantageous typing and attributes and levels, so I do feel like these cards are going to be still integral combo pieces in the future. At number 24, we have a card that was the trendsetter for modern day hand traps as we know them, in terms of being able to interrupt your opponents on their first turn, and that is of course going to be Effect Veiler. Now, Veiler is kind of surprisingly high on this list, but that's simply because it's been around for the entire decade, and time has not been a negative aging factor at all. It's been relevant for a lot of different formats, and it's really nice as just a generic level 1 tuner as well. But being able to see play as a non-once per turn effect negator when it was first released in a world where monster effect negation really wasn't prevalent, even till now where it's a lot more commonplace but still appreciated, definitely goes to show that it's one of the best survivors of Yu-Gi-Oh's power creep in this entire game. Number 23 is a card that just recently got banned, but was a very instrumental part of 2 different meta strategies, and that is going to be Nightmare Mermaid. Of course, I'm referring to Goki and Orchist here, and this card really just allowed you to just tutor out things from your deck that either served as extenders or hindrances for your opponent. This card really allows you to get cards out of your hand, it allows you to have downward pointing arrows for nightmare plays, it allowed you to do a lot of different things, and even in more niche interactions like say Mermaid Orchis, it allowed you to pitch stuff like Dragoons and trigger their effects. But this card really just allowed you to access so many things, and it was pretty bad for future-proofing, which is a big reason why people argued for it to be banned. But yeah, this card, definitely one of the best cards ever since it's released for its own purpose of enabling combos, and one that definitely was prone to being abused even more in the future. Number 22 was another Zodiac archetypal card, and one that really just flooded the board and generated so much advantage for the deck so quickly, and that's of course going to be Zodiac Rapier. Rapier, with its advantageous typing, attribute, and level, really allowed it to utilize and abuse its non-once per turn effect to just recycle itself, get itself on the board, and get Zodiacs what really they were known most for, which is continual pluses. This card is really the star of the show when it comes to the main deck lineup, and allowed the deck to just really get access to a lot of its non-engine defensive cards, as well as, again, it's easy of access and recyclability. Number 21 is probably one of the most powerful, well-rounded, and most played back row removal cards in the entire game, and that is of course going to be Twin Twisters. Twin Twisters really eclipse a lot of the other back row removal options, and despite other cards coming in and out of the formats, Twin Twister has always really just prevailed as the premier side deck option if you want to get rid of your opponent's back row. And just the discard outlet is really nice for a lot of decks. and just having the 2-for-2 trade just makes it a devastating counter to your opponent's back row. Even with cards coming out in the future and cards that have come out before, I do believe that Twin Twister is just that nice middle ground that people will continue to use moving forward, and is definitely a card to have on your hands at all times. We're getting into the top 20 now, which gets pretty interesting, and we're actually going to kick it off with a card that is, again, pretty generic, and one that I feel won't be power crept for the foreseeable future as well, and that's going to be the infamous Ash Blossom and Joy Spring. So pretty much the poster child for hand traps. This card really just allows you to cover so many different bases, and it just does so much by itself in terms of, stopping a critical play. It's really skillful as well, just being a one-time negator. It's not really like a floodgate type of card, but it definitely rewards players for knowing their matchups. It rewards players for, building accordingly and respecting this card. It's definitely a card that promotes a lot of interactivity and skill in the game, but it's also a card that is just super powerful on its own, and in certain decks, even its typing and attribute come up too. But yeah, this card is a card that can stop many different effects in the game, which allows it to be a very, very strong metagame contender, both past and present. Number 19 is the final Zodiac card on this list, and I believe that this is what really allowed the Zodiac deck and engine to be so powerful and explosive as it was, and really it's the card that without it, I don't think the deck would be even nearly as good, to be honest. And this card is going to be Zodiac Broadbull. This is the card that I really foresee can't come off the ban list, unlike something like Trident, simply because this is the card that just generated Zodiac's advantage turn after turn after turn again. Honestly, Zoo boards were somewhat breakable, but just having this card to guarantee you have an X play every turn is what allowed this deck to be as ridiculous as it was. Not to mention the fact that we have more and more Beast Warrior archetypes that are more competitively viable as Lunalights. But yeah, this card is just extremely powerful, even in the Zodiac deck or engine, and is what really allowed this deck to thrive as well as it did in my opinion. Number 18 is one of the most infamous cards in the entire game, a very hard boss monster to out of one of the most annoying decks in a lot of people's eyes, and that is going to be Masterpiece, the True Draco Slaying King. This card does a lot. It's very easily summonable, it is very, very immune to a lot of different things, and you can tailor it to whatever matchups you need to. It provides spell speed to interruption, and it is just the bane of pretty much every rogue player's existence. A lot of rogue players just simply did not have an answer to this card, and it can just win games on its own. True Draco with this deck is a lot different of a deck than True Draco without it, and it's really one of the core identifying pieces of, the deck in its history. Number 17 might actually be a surprise to some of you, but I do believe that it is one of the most underappreciated and undervalued starter cards in the entire game, and that's going to be MX Saber Invoker. This card has seen play in a lot of different decks, from things like Windups to Madolches to Zoo, of course, and even things like 60-card Lightsworn and Goki. This card has seen play in a myriad of different formats, and it's been a part of a lot of different decks ever since its release, and it's pretty remarkable how much this card actually achieved in its lifetime. It is of course banned now because of it, but I do think people still forget about how powerful and how explosive this card really can get. Definitely I do think is worthy of this spot on this list. At number 16, we have a card that's a pretty funny coincidence because this card's number in the game is number 16. But yeah, this is the enhanced version of Outer Entity Azathoth, and that is of course going to be Shockmaster. Just locking out any different card type in the game is really, really oppressive for a relatively easy monster to summon in the game. Of course, even back when windups were being played, back when Xyz first came out, they had the ability to spam monsters on the field to make this card. So this card being banned from pretty much that time on kind of goes to show how big of a threat Konami views it. And for a pretty good reason. This card is extremely, extremely unfair, and I do believe that even though it hasn't been played super much, if Azathoth had to make this list, I definitely felt like this card can make the list as well. Definitely oppressive monster. At number 15, we have a series of cards that really defined the metagame from 2013 to 2014, some of the most legendary cards of all time, and that is of course going to be the Dragon Rulers. So yeah, the Dragon Rulers were of course one of the best decks in the game's existence. Not actually quite tier 0 statistically, because there were some other decks that could technically take some top cut spots away from them, things like Spellbooks and fringe stuff like Evil Swarm come to mind, but nonetheless, these cards were so far ahead of the other cards of their time. They were leaps and bounds ahead, and they really just shaped a lot of the metagame. Of course, with them just being able to spam the board with big monsters, create really large threats like Draco Sack and Big Eye, and continually just generate advantage not only in their own pure strategy but also in other decks that they were splashed into. These cards definitely are some of the most reckoned and feared cards in the entire game. Number 14 was probably the biggest face of the Pepe strategy, and one that a lot of people are maybe still afraid to come back, and that is going to be Performapal Monkey Board. This card is just very independently strong, be able to complete your scale by itself, and that just alone is enough to really propel a Pendulum deck to high tier status. You know, this card being able to search a wide variety of different cards actually because of how strong and diverse the Performapal engine is. Really just allows you to generate so much advantage, and of course even Master Rule 3, the Pendulum Summoning mechanic was ridiculous, so just having guaranteed access to a turn after turn after turn threat if this card was not cleared allows you to just get so many different cards at your disposal, which really just contributed to a lot of Pepe's success. So definitely worthy of this spot. Number 13 is a card that I feel is actually one of the most overpowered cards ever printed, at least in recent memory. And to quote Ediception on this, Lonefire Blossom should not be in your extra deck. And of course I'm talking about Guard Dragon LP. So yeah, this card is of course just a Lonefire for dragons, which is one of the most advantageous types in the entire game. Just the potential that this card has to create so much crazy stuff is really unrivaled, and even in the absence of things like Guard Dragon Agripane, this card still really shines, and it's one of the cards that actually just prevents future card design because the dragons that Konami releases all have to really pass the LP test until it gets banned. So this card just enables so many things as a starter card, and it really is one of the most unfair cards in the entire game that is still legal. Number 12 is actually a card that maybe you might not expect on this list given how Monkey Board was just mentioned 2 spots ago, but this is another Pendulum that I actually feel, independently and in the context of the metagame it was in, and possibly future metagames if both were to come off, I feel actually is just slightly superior to it, and that's going to be Astrograph Sorcerer. So this card is, it's a lot of things actually. It's a card that you can put in your scale to get a body on the field. It's a card that you can continually abuse to just get itself on the board and more pendulums to keep spamming the board with. It's a card that would just plus you to infinity pretty much. And with cards even like Electromite Limited, this card would still be insanely powerful, just being able to get you all these different cards from like all the effects that pop cards in the game. Really allows you to just generate so much advantage, and it is one of the biggest reasons why Pendulum FTK was able to thrive as much as it did in 2018. Really a very infamous card that a lot of people were clamoring for it to be banned, and very justifiably so. Number 11 is yet another card that abuses the very imbalanced mechanic of summoning from your main deck, and with cards like LP and MX Saber Invoker high in this list, you can expect this card to be up here as well. And that's right, this is of course the infamous Summon Sorceress. So with this card being as easy to make as it is, with it just being pretty generic for most decks to make, or if your deck couldn't really make it super easily, you just had Reaper access, this card really just is the ultimate extender, getting you any monster from your deck. You can use it for Link plays, Xyz plays, Synchro plays, whatever you want, or you can just recur it from your graveyard and actually use it with so much recursion in this game as well. This card can be link climbed into other monsters. It just does it all in one card, and was really unfair for a long time, as well as being region specific for a long time too. But regardless, its impact on the game cannot be understated, and this card is probably going to be banned for as long as Yu-Gi-Oh exists. Alright guys, if you managed to stick around for this long, we are getting now into the top 10, which means we're just going to cover the best of the best, the cream of the crop cards of the entire decade. And kicking it off, we actually have a card that is a little bit difficult to evaluate, given how it's been banned for quite a number of years now, but I have no doubt that if it were to be unbanned, it would make a tremendous impact on the game, as well as, not to mention the fact that it made a huge impact when it was legal. And I am talking about Ovolvo Chain here. So this card, just being a generic rank 4 Foolish Burial or Foolish Burial goods in the game, is extremely potent to have. And it's been played in so many different decks, ranging from things like Necros to Infernities. It really was just the ultimate combo enabler and extender, and it just allows you to pull off so many different things that decks couldn't normally do otherwise. Just being a rank 4 is so easy to make, and without a doubt, this is one of the best cards that is probably worst designed in history. Really solid rank 4 in this game. Alright, at number 9, we have a card that really just shaped the way that people built their decks entirely, and I'm talking about the card count here. which of course is in reference to that grass looks greener. This card really just kind of took traditional deck building quote-unquote rules out the window and allowed people to just really experiment with a lot of unconventional deck building styles. People would just throw in all the graveyard reliant cards that they wanted to, from Infernoids to even Paleozoics or Lightsworns or whatever you wanted to, and just try to rely on this card as a essentially auto win button. This card was kind of sacky when it was drawn against you, but it made things really interesting when people would go into 6-card mirror matches and have 3 blanks in their deck as well. So it really created a very interesting dynamic of how many people were willing to play this card, or how many people were just trying to stick to the tried and true 40 cards. So this card really just defined a lot of how people approach the game, and even at 1 copy when it was at 1, still created a very powerful force in the metagame that cannot be underestimated. At number 8, we have some of the most abused cards of today's metagame that really people are just sick of by now, and those are of course Sky Striker Mobilize Engage and Sky Striker Mecha Hornet Drones. I really couldn't put one above the other, or talk about one without the other, so I decided to just put them both together because both as an engine and as a deck, like, these cards are just absolutely ridiculous in the amount of advantage that they generate, the splashability, the token generation, the link climbing. Everything about them is extremely overpowered, and these are probably just the best cards that have been released in the past couple of years. Engage is a card that people have wanted to be limited or banned from the very beginning, and it's still somehow at 3. But yeah, just the longevity that these cards have had goes to show that they really were a defining part of the latter part of this decade for sure. At number 7, we have a card that I really wanted to put on this list, and I give it a very high spot at that because despite it being one of the most divisive cards that we've ever seen in this game's history, it's also one of the most played, and that card is actually, of course, going to be Pot of Desires. So Desires is a card that really sparked so much debate between very many different players when it first came out, and even to this day some people still argue both sides of this, but the fact of the matter is that this card has seen mainstream success ever since its release in pretty much almost every format, and even though not every deck can take advantage of it, the fact that it just draws 2 pretty much almost unconditionally whenever you see it really makes this card a power that was not really in the game as in the form of this card ever since Pot of Greed got banned, of course. So this card being as generic as it is, being as easy to activate as it is, and just being able to be used in pretty much anything if you wanted to, really makes this card something that cannot really be power crept until it gets banned, if it does. But given the fact that it's been around for about 3 years now, I'm willing to say that this card is really just going to make its presence known until the end of this game. Number 6 is another very infamous card that sparked quite a bit of a debate on its own as far as whether it or its enablers should be banned. But despite this, it is still on the ban list, and it's because of its own sheer power. That is of course going to be Elder Entity Norden. The debate I was referring to is between itself and of course Instant Fusion, but Norden is just really the card that enables so many different Xyz plays and Synchro plays and what would be Link plays if it made it to that point. But this card really just enables so much in the fact that it was actually able to be summoned in decks like Fusion Sub-Zoo, so just the fact that this card could be summoned normally and still get its effect, and it's not once per turn at all, and it is recyclable by cards like Fusion Substitute and like Yugioh Emerald, really just allowed it to be one of the best cards, of course in Zoo, but also in any other deck that wanted to play Instant Fusion and just have rank 4 access. This card is one of the cards that honestly probably couldn't come back without Instant Fusion taking a hit somehow, but even still, you can probably find some players trying to abuse this card by fusing with it normally, which is why I gave it such a high spot on this list. Number 5 was a card that actually took quite a while to reach its full potential, but once it took off, it really did take off until it got banned. And that card is, of course, the infamous Vanity's Emptiness. So Emptiness was, of course, a card that is a lot worse in the solar format, but as the power creep and power levels of this game keep getting accelerated to greater and greater extents, this card just got better and better with the, of course, release of things like Clifford, them being able to take advantage of 3 of this card and 3 skill drain. You saw a lot of decks eventually playing 3 of this card, and then it got limited to 1, but it got really ridiculous when cards like DDD Curse King Siegfried and Metaphors Berthelium could either turn it off or bounce it back to your hand for future use. This card is just either a long-term floodgate or maybe just a one-turn stall until you can get rid of it yourself and OTK your opponent. Very unfair and one of the most oppressive floodgates in the entire game's history. Number 4 is one of the most controversial and contentious cards as far as its release because of its status of being on or off the ban list, and I'm sure you can already tell what this is. This is of course the only gamble card to ever really be good, and that is 6 cents. So there's not a lot to say about this card historically. It's been banned pretty much almost ever since its release, but for the very brief time where it was legal, it just took the format by storm. Of course, you could put this in any deck and have it be either a insane hand advantage generator or a very strong graveyard setup. Very insanely good card that can be played in almost any deck, and a card that will probably also never come off the ban list as well. Alright, we are getting into the really broken stuff now, of course. And at number 3, we have the card that flooded Facebook threads, YouTube threads, and the internet at large with its ultimate degeneracy. And that is, of course, going to be Firewall Dragon. So yeah, this might be surprising that it's not my number 1 or number 2 pick, but it's simply not up there because of the time factor. The other 2 cards were out longer than this card, but despite that, they've all made a pretty similar impact and you can make arguments for any of them. This card, of course, being the ultimate FTK enabler of a BS, and really had no place in the game for longer than it, was. But despite that, its banning was actually a pretty welcome surprise, and people really took that in arms and really were happy about that. This card just allowed way too much to be legal in the game with its broken effect, and definitely is a card that I feel will be banned for a very long time, even post Master Rule 2020, because of just how absurd it is. Number 2 is the most unfair comeback card ever conceived in the game's history, and allowed you to just, either extend your combos turn 1 or get you right back into the game if you were way down in cards, and that is of course going to be Soul Charge. Soul Charge is one of the most unfair and poorly designed cards ever printed. It really just doesn't have any strings attached when it comes down to the really important stuff. Just being able to make a comeback, break your opponent's board, or build your board to incredibly difficult to break levels. It just did so much by itself, and the fact that it was at 3 for so long really was a defining factor in decks like Sylvan's. But even when it was at 1, it was just that sacky top deck that you never wanted your opponent to draw into if they were playing a combo deck. And this card is banned for a very rightful reason. This card just did everything that you wanted to, essentially, in a combo-oriented deck. Alright, and before we get to our number 1, I have some honorable mentions here. We got a lot of them, so I'm not going to read them all out loud, but just know that there's even more than the ones that I listed here as honorable mentions. So, there are so many very good cards that were released in the past decade, so I do want you guys to be aware that my list is not necessarily perfect, but I would love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments down below if you have any disagreements or changes that you would make to this list. Alrighty guys, we have arrived at our number 1 pick, and I'm sure by process of elimination you guys can probably guess what this is, but still I believe it's in the running for even still best card in the game. But yeah, this card is absolutely crazy and it defines the game right as we know it, and that card is none other than Maxi. Maxi is the only card that I really knew for sure that when I was thinking of this video idea that not only would I put it on this list, but I will put it at number 1. That never changed even with all the other cards that I looked at. This card is just such a game warping card. It really is. There's nothing to say about it that doesn't involve it, being a central component of people playing their decks, people building their decks, what decks even are viable. It completely separates the OCG and TCG metagames. Even if the decks might look similar from time to time, it just affects the way that people approach the game in general. People have, long and pretty much unwavering debates about whether this card should stay at 0 or come back to 3, especially with Master Rule 2020 on the horizon. But this card is a card that really, no matter how you slice it, is going to be at the forefront of the game, whether it's at 0 or whether it's at 3. It's a card that is kind of like what Nibiru is, but in much more extreme form. It really just does everything in terms of applying the ultimate pressure and testing players to their limits. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. I really hope you guys enjoyed my top 50 countdown. I worked a long time on making the list actually, but also like I mentioned earlier, I did have some technical difficulties making it so this video came out pretty late. So I would appreciate it if you guys definitely let me know what you thought of it. in terms of the comment section down below. I'd love to hear if you guys agreed or disagreed with, certain options or like picks of this list like I mentioned earlier. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, be sure to leave a like as well as any thoughts or feedback in the comment section down below. Feel free to subscribe for more informative and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content. If you want to, you can follow me on Discord, Twitter, or Twitch. All 3 links are in the description as always. And once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I will catch you in the next video. See you guys!